Okay. What is your name?
Richard B. Stranahn, better known as Dick.
It's your class.
Oh, class of 47.
What was your address during the war?
I just filled that 800 Graceland, Des Plaines.
Okay. Tell us about your parents and any brothers and sisters that you have.
I was an only. So then I got the whole back seat to myself in the car. My father was a salesman. My mother was a homemaker. We grew up with my grandparents because although I was never discussed, I'm quite sure we went broke during the war, or I'm sorry, during the Depression. We moved an awful lot. I was born in North Dakota. We moved in with the grandparents in Des Plaines. And when I was 4, I think. And then from there went into kindergarten in Des Plaines. From there we moved to Yonkers, New York, and I did first grade. Is this the sort of thing you want?
Yeah.
All right. And then we moved again, I suppose probably for another $1 a week or whatever it was in those days, to Cleveland. I did second grade there. Then we moved to Cincinnati, and I accomplished third grade there. And then we moved back in with the grandparents again in Des Plaines. And it was a very pleasant household, really. In those days, families stayed, well, more like the ethnic groups do now, but we stayed close. In Des Plaines, the family did, for the most part, and had Sunday dinner, and some of them were there most of the time. Where do you want us to go from there?
Well, did you have any cousins or?
I had some cousins, yeah. One that graduated from Maine in 43, and he's deceased. And another one graduated from Elmhurst, I think it was. My mother and her 2 brothers all went to Knox College, and as did I. But we're ahead of ourselves at this point. You asked about family.
Yes. You said that your father was a salesman.
Mm-hmm.
What did he sell?
Well, advertising supplies, various things. Surgical supplies. I remember one of his calls was Sing Sing Prison in New York, and we in the summer I'd ride along with him sometimes, and I remember parking in the parking lot and overlooking the prison. Well, he made his sales call, if you will, on the dispensary of the hospital. Later on, he was a regional manager for Deep Freeze Corporation.
What's that?
Deep Freeze was the first to make a home freezer, and the commercial freezers were out, but there hadn't been any made for the home. And Deep Freeze was up in North Chicago, which is just south of Waukegan. And he moved to Detroit. I never lived in Detroit. I was in service or in school at that point. But I visited him, I think, twice over a holiday. And then I went back to school.
What was your neighborhood like when you were growing up?
Well, you have a lot of the same type of homes in Park Ridge. 2.5 story, expandable attic. We had a walk-up attic. I remember we never threw anything out. It was always up in the attic for me to play with. As an example of Victrola. You know, wind it up and listen. It was up there. And, I've forgotten some of the other delightful toys that were up there. After the war started, we lost the maid. She went to work in the war factory, so I took over her bedroom, which gave me direct access to the kitchen or the attic, take my choice. But I think we paid the maid something like $18 a week, plus for her own free board, and she got Thursday after dinner off, and every other Sunday. And that was all, that was a free time. Well, she was out on Saturday night too, but that was high school. My home was kind of a gathering place for my friends. And I remember my grandfather was a regional manager for Carnegie, Illinois Steel. Real good job in the 30s. And as such, a little bit of a stiff-collar guy, but a great sense of humor. And I'll never forget how aghast he was one day when a dump truck full of students showed up in front of our house. They came to visit me. I had been hurt playing football, and I was bedridden. And they all came to visit, about 15 of them, I guess. A truck, what's that truck doing out?
Did they literally come in a dump truck?
Yes, in the back of the truck.
Oh my goodness. The country was coming off the Depression when the war started. What was your economic situation in your family?
Well, I pretty much described it until the late 30s, early 40s. I'm just presuming, we never discussed it, but I'm presuming we went broke is why we moved in with a family again, and why we left North Dakota initially, aside from the fact that it was colder than hell.
My goodness. Yeah, I can imagine.
But we were well off because of my grandfather's situation. But so were most of the neighbors. The community itself was Des Plaines, Arlington Heights, Mount Prospect, was heavily German population. And we had, Willie, Preck, Lambert, think of some of the names that lived across the street from us. Hall on one side, Duffy on the other, and these are all big 2.5-story homes in most cases. They no longer exist now. That's Condo Row down there.
Oh, okay.
The Congregational Church would be the landmark. We were 2 doors south of the Congregational Church. That's where I learned to play basketball. I knew about 7 different ways to sneak into the gymnasium. And of course, the custodian never heard us, you know. We weren't supposed to be there, but.
What were you like as a teenager?
I was a bit wild. I wasn't much of a student, I admit. I didn't apply myself. And I had a lot of fun. Did a lot of dating, played a lot of sports, football and basketball particularly. Swam intramurals. I've forgotten what all else now, but athletics was my interest.
Do you have any funny stories from your teenage years? You wouldn't mind
Well,
sharing?
I can tell you, I can tell you this one. I'll get a little risky as we go on. On one occasion, I think it was our junior year, we decided we didn't want to go to we had compulsory assemblies on Fridays. And about 8 of us decided we didn't want to go to the assembly. So we ditched. I had a car. My car was very distinguishable because it had no windows on the left side. The door was sprung, and slamming the door, the glass had broken. So I put a canvas in the rear. I couldn't put a canvas in the front. It was a 2-door sedan. So the car was very distinguishable. So on this occasion, we ditched. We went over in Des Plaines, and we playing sandlot football. And one of the fellows went up, or passed, up against a tree stump, came down, badly sprained his ankle. So we had to bring him back to school, of course. We all were coming back. We weren't going to stay out all day. And we parked in the parking lot, and of course, Stan had to be sacrificed. There was no way he was going to run anywhere. And so we dropped him off in a blind area, in I said Main East now. It was just Main then. And went into and then parked our cars in two separate areas. Well, I stayed in mine. I got down in the front seat and stayed in it, and a couple of guys got out and ran for it. One of them happened to be a fellow who was a state champion in track. And we had an assistant principal at that time. He was Calvin C. Legg, 2 G's. He was better known as Harry among the students, of course, as you can imagine. And everybody had a nickname. We had one woman who was very heavy. She was called Stonewall Jackson, but because of her physique. But in any case, so they were building these Quonset huts out where your football field is now at Maine, and they had crops. We had Farmer May was our agricultural teacher.
What were the Quonset huts for?
They were for teachers who couldn't find places to live, and yet the school had about 1,500 students in it. It was built for 1,100, so we were on kind of partial shifts. I'm getting away from the end of this story, and then let me come back. So they took off, and I stayed in the car, and here came the manual arts, they call it now. We called it shop in those days. Guys had been out working on the Quonset huts. So they came, and they had their hats, and they had their tools, and they were carrying them. So I hollered at one of the guys I knew, and I said, "Hey, give me a hammer." So he gave me his hammer, and I walked in with him, carrying this hammer. And of course, they knew, all my gang was lined up there in front of the assembly hall. Every one of them had been caught, except me. So I walked on by, and they all just kind of did this, and didn't say a word. And Harry, Calvin, knew I was guilty, knew I hung with that gang. But here I was coming in, he wasn't sure whether I was in the shop gang or not, so I got away with it. The rest of them did a little suspension, and I don't know what else they did. It wasn't too serious, but it was punishment of some sort. You asked about some other incidents. Well, I told some of these stories at this assembly, if you will, at the Maine East. As I said, I was running with a lively crowd, let's put it that way. And it was war years, and a lot of places that served liquor really didn't care how old you were, or if you had a fake ID, which most of us did. They knew damn well. I looked 12, and if that old. And in fact, I'll tell you a story about later years. And so they'd serve us. One place I can remember was called Ma Guzman's. It was out on Milwaukee Avenue, and her significant other, whether it was a husband or not, I don't know. It was about 2 doors from the sheriff's department. It was used to be over there on, it's I think, a Niles Museum now. It was about just very, very close to the so the phone would ring, and they'd usher us out the back. The sheriff would come in the front, look around, of course, nothing going on. And they'd leave, and we'd come back in. And on one occasion, I remember we were in the countryside, which was just about where this high school is. And the longest now, it's over on Ballard Road. Excuse me. We were in there having a beer, myself and another fellow. And the phone rang. And we were probably 17, maybe. And bartender answered it and went over and walked around the end of the bar and shut down a steel door behind us. It had 4 slot machines in that little room. And of course, gambling was illegal, but it was prevalent. And about 5 minutes later, here came the sheriff, or one of his deputies. They went down the end of the bar and discussed some things, I think.
Oh.
I couldn't see. But, and then he left and paid no attention to us at all, even though I said I looked 12. So, I can't think of any other instance of that nature right now. I talked about buying black market gas.
Tell us about that again.
Well, you know, you're 16 years old and you're driving a car and you're dating, and there's no way you're going to give a 16-year-old a driver's license and a car and not have him get gas. Well, I think it was 7 gallons a week that we were allowed as an A card. And my grandfather was head of it was a paying job, but he took it as a volunteer, as a $1 a year man, head of the regional ration board, where you appealed to get if you needed tires or you needed an extra C card, which was more gasoline, or a B card, which is a little less. So I had to be awfully careful. My father, I'm sure, was aware of the fact that the car was building up mileage, but was never anything said around the house. We paid, I think, 50 cents a gallon. It was exorbitant those days because gas was running about 17.5, 18 cents a gallon, legitimate. And there was one down on the corner of Ozark and Northwest Highway is the one I remember particularly that we used to frequent. We got a little extra gasoline here and there to keep us happy. I mentioned looking 12. I'll jump ahead for just a minute. When I was in service, I knew every inspection we had that the inspecting officer, be it a captain or an admiral, was going to stop in front of me because I looked 12 still. And I knew exactly what he was going to say. He'd stop up in front of me and say, son, how long have you been in this man's Navy? And I'd answer whatever it was. Last time was 3 years. Walked out. I'm sorry, I got off the track of high school for you. What other questions you have for me for high school?
Can you tell us a little bit about, you said something about how you went in shifts for school?
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. If you were in athletics, because you had to have time for practice after school, you went in at, I think, I'm a little hazy on these times, but correct me, but I think it was when you had to start at 7:30. And other classes started all the way up till 9 o'clock, every half hour. And the lunchroom was on shifts also. My recollection is that we had 20 minutes in the lunchroom and another 10 minutes, excuse me, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Another 10 minutes, you come down from the lunchroom. In those days at Maine East, it was right over the gymnasium, was the lunchroom. And there was a stairs that came down into the gym. And they had a jukebox in the gym, so for that 10 minutes we'd dance or whatever, listen to music or whatever. But it was only a 30-minute lunch period all told, and you were expected to be out of there in 20 minutes to make room for the next group coming in. And then you got out anywhere from 2:30 to 3:30 or 4 o'clock maybe, depending on when you started and how many study halls you had. They'd cut into a study hall too if you had athletics, as I recall. So you get out and you were on the athletic field at 3 o'clock without in gear, not just in the locker room.
I have to say I like that schedule better than ours.
What's yours like?
We, everybody starts school at 7:45, and then everybody has a lunch period somewhere between 10:30 and 1:30.
Oh, okay. So you're on
And-
shifts also.
Yeah, and we have about 20 minutes to eat, 15 or so.
That
if
sounds
it's-
familiar.
Yeah, and then you have classes, everybody has classes until 3:15, and you don't get to leave early or come in later unless you are a senior and you have to study first or last period.
It seems to me that my son went to we talked about earlier. He graduated here in '79. Seems to me he started at 8 o'clock. Although his freshman year, I was dropping him off at 7 because I thought school started at 7. Turns out he was doing detention for an hour before school. never bothered to mention that. To me, anyway. He may have told his mother, but it was about a month before I caught on what was going on. He was a little mischievous, too. Although he was a very good student. In fact, he's a physicist at this point.
Oh, how many girlfriends did you have?
Well, I don't know how to answer that. How many dates or girlfriends?
Either or.
I went steady with about 5 different girls. And I can recall all of them, I think, where the freckles were and all that stuff. But I dated, some others. It wasn't a gang, like I see, like my son was, a gang of them would go out together. And we had specific, boys that go out by themselves too. And hang out at, up in Rand Road, and there was a tavern up there we liked. And Fox and Hounds it was called. And sometimes the girls would come in there. And in those days, incidentally, ladies, it was legal for the women to drink at the age of 18, whereas men had to be 21. So the ladies had a lot fewer problems than we did in bouncing around for a beer. And we were pretty much all beer drinkers. The proms, we'd go down to Congress Hotel. I've forgotten what the name of the room was. The Sherman. We go down to the ballrooms there, and of course, we're in our dress clothes, and they'd serve us liquor. There was no question, it was a high school prom, but I'm sure they wanted the drinks. But I'd order a whiskey and water, and they'd get a whiskey and water.
Wow.
But they didn't, it was just a different atmosphere. First of all, there weren't that many cars on the road, particularly during the war. And secondly, they were built like tanks. You really had to work at getting one. So the safety factor was a little better, or a little less, whatever you want to call it. We used to drag toboggans behind cars down through streets in Park Ridge and Des Plaines. Nobody ever stopped us. Skate on the river. I was the greatest goalie to ever be on the Des Plaines River in galoshes. My ankles were just like this. I had no way could I skate on skates. So I'd wear galoshes and play goalie. Believe me, that puck stung when somebody hits your galoshes with it.
Ow.
But the river froze over north of, our skating rink was north of Rand Road on the Des Plaines River in there. Somebody put up lights too, so we were there at night.
So was that the school hockey team, or was it just
No,
guys
there was
getting
no
together?
school hockey team. There was no, the baseball had been suspended during the war years. They started baseball again my senior year, spring of '47. And as I recall, they played their games over at the Croatian home, which was across the street from Maine. Now, Maine East I'm talking about. That's now in a condo complex. But they had, a lot of our athletes came from that Croatian home. It was for either total orphan children or broken families, or dad was in the war, or mom, and there was no mom, or whatever it was. They're the most delightful guys in the world. Some of them were a little rough, but they had a gymnasium and a swimming pool. And so they were, they played a lot of tackle football just for fun, without any equipment over there. So they were almost all of them, great athletes. And they'd fill our our basketball, particularly, and football teams as well. Tomic, Horich, Knezevich, Painich. Those are some of the names I remember. They were all ended in ICH, most part. There was one girl named Rosemary, too, and I've forgotten what her last name was. She was a good student. Their problem, they hadn't had, the grammar school was done there at the home. Then they come into high school with us, and they were behind in their English courses particularly. So they had some trouble picking up there, where the rest of us had pretty good basic knowledge. I know I did. There was no excuse for me not being a good student, because I had a good elementary school education, and I did well in elementary. But I fell in love in high school, and that was some problems. And of course, there was more athletics than there were in junior high. All we had in junior high was a swim team, no football, no baseball, swim and gym. I think that was it. And we'd have a play day once a year, and we'd go up against Lincoln Junior High in basketball, swimming, ping pong. I think that was it. They'd pick their team, we'd pick our team in junior high. It was called Jefferson Junior High in Des Plaines, and it was Lincoln in Park Ridge. And in fact, I was in junior high when the war broke out, the 7th grade. And the principal brought us all into an assembly in the theater at the building. And we listened to Roosevelt's address declaring war on the Japanese. And that was the Monday after, I think it was the Monday after the Sunday. And I came home from the movies on Sunday, and my grandparents were gathered around the radio listening. And of course, I had no idea where Pearl Harbor was at that point. And that's when I heard about what had happened. Of course, it didn't immediately. And we didn't have television. We didn't fight the war on television like we did the Vietnam War. And since then, you'd go to the movies and they'd have newsreels, heavily censored newsreels that they'd show, and then of course they only showed us winning. You can imagine. I'm sure they just changed uniforms for the Germans, and they had them winning, but they showed them in Germany. I digress. Go ahead. What's the next one?
No, keep talking. It's okay. I was actually going to ask you about the start of the war. So.
Well, that's what I remember. I'll go on with what we did as kids. We had a civilian defense program. My dad used to refer to himself as a blockhead. He was a sectional warden, I think, yes, they call him. And he had like 3 or 4 wardens around the Des Plaines that were supposed to report to him. And I was his messenger. I had a little band on my arm and a lightning streak down it. And I guess my job was supposed to be go and wake up the wardens when the war, if they bombed Des Plaines. So we did have one. We talked about the air raid drill, the fake air raid we had, where they dropped balloons with various colored objects on the end, and the object that was dropped, the color of it determined what size bomb was dropped there, and then they could figure what the damage area would have been. And the homeowners were supposed to turn those in and tell them where they were dropped. They flew over a Piper Cub and dropped these things.
Oh, okay.
And, or I say Piper Cub, I don't know what, a small aircraft anyway. And we went to classes at the junior high. We actually, it was World War I, poison gas was very prevalent, used quite a bit, and by the Germans. We only heard about the Germans. I suspect we may have used a little sarin ourselves. So we were drilled in what type of gas. They had simulated scents for mustard, I remember that's the only one I think I have now. And you'd sniff this bottle and you'd know what mustard gas smelled like. It was not mustard gas, of course. And then another kind of cyanide and whatever else. And it was one of the courses they taught us. And of course, there was also some aircraft, I think, recommendation, IFF, identification, friend or foe.
Now, this was in junior high?
This is junior high and early high school, yeah.
Okay.
Because the war ended at the end of my junior year. In my junior year, I turned 16. And aside from the exciting experience of getting my driver's license, of course, I also went to work in a war factory, part-time while in school, and then full-time in summer. I was Ricky the Riveter. They were making, if you've seen these pictures, have they seen the pictures of the C-54? That's what we were building out there at Douglas Aircraft.
So where were you working at the?
At Douglas.
Oh, you were, okay. And you were a riveter?
I was a riveter, yeah.
Oh, okay.
I was, believe it or not, I was small in those days, thin. And guys like me they'd take us and thin women, and sometimes you get a thin woman in with you, which wasn't bad. When we had to climb up in the area where the landing gear retracted, there's an area about that size. Climb up in the wing and test for gasoline leaks, because the wings were the tanks. And they'd seal the tank, the wing rather, and pump it full of air, and then you'd soap the outside of the plane and mark the rivets where it was leaking in the rivets with a grease pencil. Well, then the exciting part was, for a guy like me, was to climb back in there with no air protection. Of course, you had an air hose like you have at the gas station to put air in your tires. You brought that in with you for a little air circulation. And the guy on the outside would count, and you'd start at a certain place, count down, and then he'd tap twice where there was a bad rivet. And you had a steel bar of various shapes that you put up against that rivet, and he'd bang it again from the outside. So it was a little noisy in there. But you try and keep count of where you were and because every 16 inches probably there was rivets and all the way around the wing. So it was interesting work. So we were sacrificial lambs. That's what we were. And I had the laziest lead man in the world. He'd send me up in the wing, and then nothing had happened. And I kept waiting. Finally, I'd climb out, and he was gone. He'd taken off to go do something else. And there was a lot of that shirking, I guess you'd call it. Guys that just really hadn't had jobs and didn't like this 8 to 5 stuff and being forced to stay at a workstation. Us young kids were a little more eager, and women were younger, of course.
How much did you get paid? Do you remember back then?
I got all the way up to 90 cents an hour.
That's pretty good.
My first job was at the tally hall, where the bank is now, or the bank parking lot. It was 37.5 cents an hour.
Was it the Tally Ho? What kind of?
It was a restaurant. It was a tea room type restaurant.
Okay.
And the ladies would go and eat the stuffed tomato and play bridge afterwards. They'd set up, they'd get them in there to have lunch. They'd let them use the tables until dinner time, I guess, if they wanted to. The ladies like my grandmother who weren't working or didn't do anything, elder women for the most part. And I was a busboy there. Another friend of mine, he got to be out front. I was a potato peeler and dishwasher, pretty much. But he got to be out front where he got to wear a white jacket and the whole thing. He came home one day and he told his mother he had bread and buttered Jeanette MacDonald. Now, Jeanette MacDonald you never heard of, I'm sure, but she was a singer of that operatic type singer back in then. So, but he was all excited. He bread and buttered, as a busboy. They put out the butter and the bread and the water and all that stuff. he was all excited he'd seen a celebrity.
Mm-hmm.
From there, I worked in an ink factory down in Belmont. These are summers now. Sanford Ink. And my dad had dropped me off in the morning, and then I'd have to find my way home from Bellwood down Manheim, and I was hitchhiking. Of course, hitchhiking was not uncommon in those days,
Really?
because not everybody had it. First of all, a lot of people had put their car in storage because it was too expensive to keep it. They put it in storage in the 30s because they couldn't keep it up. And secondly, you only had those 7 gallons. So it wasn't uncommon, and of course, military we picked up immediately. And young, decent-looking fellows like me, at least that's my own opinion, were easily picked up too, by hitchhikers or as hitchhikers. But I had all the colors of the rainbows in my clothes, from ink, all various colors of ink that I'd been bottling that day, and every so often one would break, and as you were putting the top on it, you get sprayed with ink. So I was the hitchhiking rainbow. But I'm trying to think what other jobs I had. After school, after high school, I had some other jobs, but I think that was pretty much it in high school. Any other?
After the start of the war, did anyone in your family or any relatives join the army?
I only had one first cousin. Well, I had one first cousin who was caught in the Philippines. Lieutenant Billy McGill, and he died in a prison camp in the Philippines. His brother-in-law was an adjutant to MacArthur, Colonel Moore, and Colonel Moore went on to become the I don't know what the title was, the administrator anyway of Okinawa, after he left MacArthur's staff. He was a cousin-in-law for me. And my cousin, on my mother's side, with Bennett's, he went in, he spent the war in school. I'll swear, he went from one to another and to another to another. Bowdoin, MIT, Illinois State. Lord, I don't know, there were 5 or 6 different colleges he went to in the V-12 program, which was naval officers. And he ended up on an auxiliary boat in China somewhere after the war as a radio man or radio officer. But he never saw any action. And I was in service and I never saw any action. Went in 1948. I was frustrated. I'd been a year in college. I hadn't done well. I hadn't been yet thrown out, but I was on that road. And I joined the Navy for a year. They had a program, they were desperate to keep these naval stations running and operating, to keep the pilots flying, because they wanted to keep the flight squadrons active. In an emergency, they didn't realize it, but they did need them. And so I enlisted for a year at Glenview Naval Air Station, where for 3 months they put me on the line working on airplanes and starting, and I was basically the guy standing by with a fire bottle to put out the fire, because these things would backfire and catch fire quite frequently when you started them up in the morning. These were propeller planes from World War II. That was all we had. And then they decided that the summer was over and most of these squadrons were not coming in anymore. And they banked a lot of the planes. They didn't need me anymore on the line. They didn't need a lot of us on the line, as it was called. So they pointed at me and another fellow and said, "Report to dispensary, you're going to be corpsman."
Mm-hmm.
I tried everything I could because I'm not good around injured or wounded. But I couldn't get out. So I spent my year. Then I was inactive reserve. I didn't go to drills, I didn't have to do anything, but I still was subject to call in an emergency. Well, the emergency came. a little less than a year, well, a little over a year after I got out, and I got called back in during the Korean War. And at that point, I decided I'd had enough of this sticking needles in people and picking up bodies, because basically that's what they gave me, because I wasn't skilled. I could do that. Yeah. I won't go into what kind of accidents we had, but there were some atrocious ones.
Were you in the Korean War?
No. Well, I was in during that period, but I finagled my way out of Fleet Marine Force. The Navy corpsmen were the medics for the Marine Corps,
Right.
and that's where I was headed when I was called back. And the senior medical officer, who I won't get into details, ladies, but who I'd done some favors for, he said, I got your orders here to go to Great Lakes. And he said, you want to go? And I said, hell no, I don't want to go. And he said, well, okay, so I can keep you here 120 days. I said, that's a start. And because I still had 3 years left on my enlistment. So at that point, I took one of the other officers said to me, one of the new medical men that came in, he said, you ought to be an officer. He said, why don't you try flight training? I said, okay. So I did, and once you passed your tests for flight training, you were locked in the base where you were stationed. So they didn't have to go find you then, was the idea. So from January to May, from November 12th until May, I was back at Glenview again. And I went to Pensacola and had trouble getting the wheels on the right side of the aircraft. Sometimes I had them up, sometimes I had them on the wrong side, flipped the plane, ground looped the plane, tried to land with the wheels down. My instructor finally said, that's it. As desperate as they were for pilots. They didn't figure I was going to be much of a cure. So we were literally losing the Korean War when I was discharged in February of 1952. Shows how valuable I was to the war effort. I'm sorry, I run on. What else do you have?
Maine High School had assemblies when soldiers were killed. Do you remember that?
Do the what?
They had some assemblies when some of their former students were killed in the war. Do you remember any of that?
No, I don't.
No? Okay. The war bond drive to buy a C-54
Right.
happened in 1944, 1945. What do you remember about that?
Well, I think I was the room stamp guy or something like that. And I've forgotten the stamp started at 10 cents, I think.
I think that's what we've heard.
Yeah.
And 10 and 25, and some of the parents would buy a war bond at 1875, bought you a $25 war bond, as I recall, in 10 or 20 years maturity. Doesn't matter. And so, but I was in the classroom, our homeroom, I was the stamp guy. So I went to that ceremony out there at O'Hare when we dedicated the flight. For the life of me, I can't find myself in those pictures, but I remember the situation.
What do you remember about VE Day?
I was on the golf course at Rob Roy when the whistles started blowing, or was that VJ Day? I know VE Day. I remember riding up and down Harlem Avenue, which was a two-lane road in those days, up in what is now would be Niles and Toohey in that area. Toohey in Harlem in that area, and riding on the hood and on the top of a 32 Buick. And the fellow's name who was driving it was Statler. He was a year older than I was, because I wasn't old enough to be driving. But we were just all cheering and shouting, and I got home at, the buses had stopped running. And I was in serious trouble at home, let's put it that way, for not having reported in, and it was getting daylight when I walked from Park Ridge to Des Plaines. Took Bussy, because that was the shortest way, rather than going Northwest Highway to Dempster. And there weren't any cars out to hitchhike a ride from. But I'd been spending time with one of my girlfriends.
What do you remember about BJ Day?
I think it was VJ Day that I was on the golf course, out at Rob Roy, and the whistle started blowing. And we all, again...
You mean factory whistles? Like?
Yeah, factory whistles, sirens, that type of thing. Excuse me. About anything that make noise. And I got home late that night too. Different girl. But I really don't remember any specific celebrations other than my own. That's about all I can recall. I know this. Within 2 days, I got a phone call telling me, I reported to work the next day at Douglas and was sent home. And they closed the factory. And all but supervisory people were turned away because they weren't going to need any more airplanes like they were turning them out there. And I was told I'd get a phone call within a week and given a specific time to come pick up my personal things and turn in my tool chits. You had a little, looked like a shower hanger, which you had little yellow chips on with your number on it. And anytime you checked out a tool from a tool crib, you had to give them one of those chits and they'd give you the tool. So they knew where it went, was the idea. It still disappeared, but I didn't get any of them. That wasn't my intention. So I had to turn that in and I had tools in my locker and get a jacket in my locker, I recall, and I had to come back and turn that in. That's about all I remember of that time. Oh, I do remember my dad and I, we were originally going to take the train. My dad's home was Fargo, North Dakota, and we were going to take the train to Fargo. His mother was living there, and his mother and his sister. And within a couple of weeks, they took gas rationing off the board, and we ended up driving up to Fargo instead. It took us an eternity, because these old tires, we'd have, I don't know how many flat tires we had on the way up. In those you had tubes in those days. You just
Right.
kept putting a new tube in the old tire.
Oh, right, and you couldn't get probably tires back then.
No. And if you did get, they weren't new tires, they were retreads.
All right. Yeah,
The trucks still use retreads now.
right.
You'll see the alligators in the road sometimes, as the truckers call them, where the retread has come off.
So when they laid off all the people, did that affect? I mean, how about the jobs and everything? Right.
I was, at 16, you weren't interested in the economy. You know, you were interested in yourself and your girlfriend.
Sure.
And I really, my dad wasn't affected, my grandfather was. My grandfather had retired from Carnegie Illinois Steel, which became U.S. Steel, or was absorbed by U.S. Steel. And he was gone a year, and they asked him to come back to work because all of the people that had taken his job and the salesmen had all been drafted. So he came back and worked a year, and then he came back and volunteered to take over the regional head of the draft board after that to keep himself active. He was also very active in the whole family was in the Congregational Church in Des Plaines. You're hard not to be if you live 2 doors from it.
Huh.
Do you have any advice that you would give the younger generation?
Don't screw up like I did. Ladies are wonderful, but Don't let them be your whole life, and screw up your academics, or let athletics do it either. I mean, you can do both if you put your mind to it, and you can do a very good job with all three if you put your mind to it. But don't forget everything else like I did. I got out of college 8 years later. I was in and out of college 3 times. Got married finally my junior year in college. I was 25. My wife was 21. In the meantime, I had settled down, and I finally graduated with a B-plus average, in spite of all the D's and F's I'd gotten in the first year and a half. So I was very proud of doing that, but I was a little old too. I was the only veteran in school at that point. When I started, they were almost all 80% veterans coming back from the war in college in the fall of '47. But when I left, I was the only veteran in school. Now, this was Knox, college of 900 students probably.
Where is it? Where's Knox College?
Galesburg, Illinois.
Okay.
And in fact, I was back there the weekend before last for a fraternity reunion and college reunion also. My fraternity, like me, has been expelled from campus. It was a Phi Delta, which is a national fraternity. And they did all the things we used to do when I was 18. And it didn't fly a few years later. And they were, finally, even the national took their charter.
Oh, my.
Because then at the fraternities these days, at least so I'm told, don't allow liquor in the fraternity houses anymore. And they didn't allow it then, but they winked at it, because most of the guys at the fraternity house were in their mid-20s. And it was, they could go anywhere they wanted to, or they were somewhere 19 or 20, but they had no problem getting drinks in the service. So they winked at it, that we'd have a party, and they called it the Bowery Party. And everybody came dressed as a bum, or thereabouts, in your dates. And of course the punch was spiked. You always had to have a faculty member and a representative from every other fraternity on campus at all your parties. I mean, that was just a courteous thing. So we knew which faculty members to invite. And then, if you can imagine, this is off the record now, I hope.
Right.
But then after that, in my first couple of years, we'd rent a tavern or a roadhouse after 1 o'clock, because they had 1 o'clock closing, and we continue the Bowery Party there till God knows when in the morning. And of course, the sheriff could never realize they saw those cars in the parking lot either in those days. But it was you had some normal students and some normal people. I can't say that I was typical. Although the group I ran with, none of us went to jail. Although I did spend one day in the brig, but I wasn't guilty. We were cleaning barracks, and they came on back to check on us, and they found some clothing stashed under the stairway. So they backed up a semi-truck. There were probably about 20 of us working in the building, cleaning out lockers. The building was supposedly secured. But if there was a locked locker, you were supposed to leave it alone. And put us all in a semi and drove us over to the brig and unloaded us. And I had no idea why we were there. And until somebody came clean, they just kept us there. All punished for one. That was the military. Patrol your buddies. Now, once again, I go ahead.
Well, I think I'm done with questions. Do you
I
have
some
any?
questions. Did you say your mom went to Knox College?
She did. My mom and her 2 brothers.
Can you tell me what they studied?
My mother graduated from Maine in 1923. She graduated from college in 1928. So you can see she took after me. Although I was only 5 years for her. It was. My mother was very musically inclined, as well, most of my family was,
Oh.
on my mother's side.
So did they take like music classes?
She did, and she was quite active in the school shows and that sort of thing. In fact, she wrote some music for some of the school plays. I'm told. I wasn't there, obviously.
No. What instruments did she play?
She played piano. And if you'd hum it, she'd play it. She could play anything by ear, which I guess is, I never realized it because it happened all the time in my house, but I guess that's quite a talent.
My other question is, what was your opinion of the war? What did you think of it and how did you feel towards it?
I don't think we had any choice. There's no question in my mind as I look back that we were enticed into it by Roosevelt. It wasn't the right thing to do the way he did it, but we should have been involved before. But we had isolationists. Taft, as an example, voted against Lend-Lease for Russia and Britain in 1940. How could you not see the need for our help for them? Well, his idea was neutrality at all costs, like the Swiss. And politically, my family did not like Roosevelt.
Huh.
We were staunch Republicans. I have since, and this is not part of your discussion, but I have since changed my attitude, and I'm voting for the candidate, not the party these days. In fact, I voted for Obama, I'll tell you. I voted for him twice. It wouldn't have been my first choice. My first choice wasn't running. And I didn't like his opponents at all.
When did your after college? What career would you spend?
I was in
most of your time?
sales, in industrial sales. We manufactured brass and copper for industry, automotive radiators. In those days, they were all copper and brass. Electrical hardware, pole line hardware, connectors. I'm trying to think of some of the main markets that we had. Caskets, casket liners. That was pretty much it. I was here in the Midwest the whole time. Worked for 2 different companies. One for 29 and a half years. And they reorganized the whole company and spun off two divisions and laid off about 100 people in the sales department. And as you say, in the educational business, I was riffed. I went to work for another company, a smaller company, that made only one product line. That was wire, brass and bronze wire. And I was regional manager for them. And I did an awful lot of traveling then. Fortunately, we didn't have the hassle at the airports like you have now, trying to get through security. In fact, when I first started traveling, it was government controlled. The fares were, and the schedules, the whole thing. And you could buy a ticket on one airline and go on another one. There was no change, the fares were all the same. And they decentralized or whatever my word, I forgot the word.
Regulated.
Deregulated, thank you. And still, there was no check security of any sort unless you looked so funny. And you could switch within your own airline, but now they've got all sorts of, I got caught up in one a couple of years back. It almost cost me $700 till I pleaded my case. The security made me miss my flight, and they made me buy a whole new ticket. Because I'd had a non-changeable ticket, round-trip ticket. This was the back end of it. Well, I appealed it and finally got all but $50 back. You got any more?
Just on the Quonset huts, they were building those for during the teachers. Was that during the war? Or
It was right after the war,
oh, after the war.
when the teachers were, or people were coming home from the war and had no place to live.
Oh, okay.
And they were expanding the staff here to meet an ever-increasing enrollment.
Right.
And as I said, we had 1,700, I think it was, or 1,600, in a school built for just a little over 1,000.
Yeah.
Again, I'm back in Maine, not here. My son went here. And I lived in Park Ridge for 36 years, so, and grew up in Des Plaines, as I told you. But after we were married, moved back to the Chicago area, that's when I came to Park Ridge. Let me ask you girls some questions, can I?
Yes, I'm just gonna turn the camera off because we're
You've been
almost-
recording all those
Yes.
dribblings?
Yes.